Buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Vamos a hablar una vez más del cambio climático. Ayer lo estuvimos haciendo en un foro de geopolítica, nada menos que en el Congreso de los Diputados. No sé si nos escucharon o no, espero que hoy nos escuchen también. Hoy vamos a hablar de las leyes climáticas y escenarios de transición energética, la experiencia interesantísima del Reino Unido y la situación en la que podemos encontrarnos en España, ¿no? Como sabemos, después del fracaso de la cumbre de Copenhague, el Acuerdo de París fue posible gracias a toda una serie de elementos que se sumaron positivamente, un consenso científico fuerte relativo al cambio climático de origen antropogénico, a la reducción de costes también de las energías renovables y a un apoyo político casi universal y una creciente preocupación ciudadana, que ha crecido muchísimo. Es interesante en este sentido, como ejemplo de ello, el reciente informe de riesgos globales del Foro Económico Mundial, que se presentó en Davos ahora hace pocos días, un informe que se elaboró a partir de encuestas a casi 1.000 expertos y decisores políticos a nivel mundial y que concluía que los riesgos ambientales, eventos meteorológicos extremos, desastres naturales, falta de acciones para mitigar y adaptarnos al cambio climático, crisis hídricas, son los riesgos globales más probables y con mayor impacto, nada menos, más probables y con mayor impacto. De hecho, el barómetro del Instituto Elcano también de opinión pública en España, que publicamos hace poco, ponía de manifiesto también cómo la preocupación por el cambio climático había subido en el nivel de preocupaciones en España a los primeros lugares, ¿no? De modo que estos riesgos ambientales aparecen de manera recurrente y han crecido claramente en importancia. Volviendo al Acuerdo de París, sabemos que la implementación de dicho acuerdo depende del desarrollo y de la puesta en marcha de regulación climática nacional y local. Hay países que cuentan ya con dicha regulación desde hace tiempo. Es el caso, sin duda alguna, del Reino Unido, que aprobaba en el 2008 su Climate Change Act, una legislación pionera que introducía presupuestos de carbono y que establecía un órgano independiente, el Comité de Cambio Climático, cuya misión consiste en asesorar al Gobierno sobre los objetivos climáticos, informar sobre los progresos en materia de reducción de emisiones y de adaptación a las consecuencias del cambio climático y que, de acuerdo con la conversación que acabo de tener con Ordeu, parece que tiene también ciertas competencias ejecutivas y de regulación. Tiene poderes, no solamente un órgano asesor, ¿no? España, por su parte, lo sabemos, se compromete en París a aprobar una ley de cambio climático y de transición energética antes de que finalice esta legislatura. En 2017, el año pasado, comenzaron ya los trabajos de desarrollo con unas jornadas de expertos y en este contexto de elaboración de esa ley, el Programa de Energía y Cambio Climático del Instituto Elcano, que dirige Gonzalo Escribano, tiene como objetivo, en este momento, entre otras cosas, analizar las iniciativas internacionales comparadas sobre lo que podemos llamar la gobernanza climática. Llevamos, por ello, hacía tiempo haciendo un seguimiento regular de las negociaciones climáticas internacionales. Está disponible en nuestra página web. Y el programa participa, además, en proyectos de investigación financiados por la Comisión Europea dentro de las iniciativas de Europa 2020, al menos en tres programas. El proyecto MUSTEC, para el análisis de la difusión de la energía solar de concentración del sur al centro y norte de Europa. El proyecto NAIAD, analizando valor seguro de los ecosistemas, y el proyecto EDUCEN, que analiza el papel de la cultura en la gestión de desastres y la reducción de riesgos. Nuestros investigadores del Elcano participan además en proyectos financiados por el Ministerio de Economía, Industria y Competitividad, analizando el papel de China y de la iniciativa de la nueva ruta de la seda. Y el programa también hace un seguimiento de la política energética y climática de los grandes emisores. Hemos organizado jornadas en materia de financiación climática y participado en procesos nacionales de consulta. Nuestra labor como think tank en este tema, como en tantos otros, es contribuir al análisis, al debate, a la clarificación de los problemas, y eso es lo que nos lleva hoy a celebrar esta mesa redonda, con el objetivo, como decía, de compartir experiencias sobre este tema. Por ello tenemos el placer y el honor de contar con uno de los artífices de la Ley de Cambio Climático del Reino Unido y actual presidente del Comité de Cambio Climático, Lord Devon, y también con el catedrático de ICAI e investigador del MIT, Pedro Linares Llamas, que presentó recientemente sus escenarios sobre la transición energética en España para el periodo 2030-2050. Como brocha a esta discusión y como colofón y para clausurarla, contaremos, estoy seguro, con la presencia de la secretaria de Estado de Medio Ambiente, doña María García Rodríguez, a quien tuvimos ya el placer de escuchar en Bonn el pasado año en la COP23. Y modera el debate la investigadora principal del Real Instituto Elcano, Lara Lázaro. Por último, quería agradecer al Ministerio de Agricultura, Pesca y Alimentación y Medio Ambiente, a la Oficina Española del Cambio Climático y a la European Climate Foundation por su apoyo en el desarrollo de esta mesa redonda. Muchas gracias de nuevo a todos ustedes por acompañarnos y paso, por lo tanto, la dirección del seminario a Lara Lázaro.
Muchas gracias, presidente. Muchas gracias, presidente, y gracias a todos ustedes por asistir hoy a este acto que tenemos el honor de tener aquí a Lord Deben. Lord Deben es, como comentaba el presidente del Comité de Cambio Climático. Fue el secretario de Estado que más tiempo ha ostentado este cargo en el Reino Unido. También fue ministro de Agricultura, Pesca y Alimentación. Tiene una consultoría de responsabilidad social y temas éticos en el Reino Unido que se llama Sancroft. Y bueno, Lord Deben ha sido muy amable en venir aquí y queremos pedirle que, por favor, pues nos cuente cuál es la experiencia, cómo llegaron a desarrollar esta ley de cambio climático, que ha servido de modelo no solo a países como a Suecia, a Austria, Bulgaria, sino que el Comité de Cambio Climático, por ejemplo, lo han adoptado también en México. So without further ado, I would... Yes, here. So without further ado, I would please Lord Deben be very happy to hear about how the Climate Change Act came about, what the Committee on Climate Change does, how difficult it was, how easy it was, your successes in terms of reducing your carbon emissions and growing at the same time, and how you have, as we all know, achieved the first budgets and how the fourth and fifth budget are going to come about.
Well, thank you very much, and I am very pleased to be here and only humbly apologetic that I speak in English rather than Spanish, but my Spanish is confined to such gastronomic terms as are necessary to buy some of my favourite foods. So that at least shows my enthusiasm for Spain. As a start, I mean, the Climate Change Committee was the product of a fascinating opposition deal. The Conservative Party was in opposition, the major opposition party, to a Labour government, and the Conservative Party got together with Friends of the Earth and wrote the climate change bill. So it was a cooperation between a political party and an NGO. And we then went off to get the whole of the rest of the opposition on side, because it was obviously very important that we should be united on the opposition side. So we got the Scots nationalists and the Welsh nationalists and the independents and the Liberal Democrats and even the Protestant Unionists from the north of Ireland who have religious difficulties about the length of time the earth has existed and other things which make conversation somewhat difficult. But they signed up as well. And then we went to the then government of Gordon Brown and said, we've got the whole opposition behind this act, and we've got 100 Labour members of Parliament who will defy the Labour whip and vote with us. So we have a majority. So here's the bill, you introduce it. So it becomes not a party political issue, it becomes a government bill presented to Parliament. Well, he didn't like it much because he came out of the Treasury, and Treasuries never like climate change acts not because they're antagonistic to green measures, but because, of course, they don't like any restrictions on the decisions that they make from day to day. And when I say this in any country around the world, whether it's Vietnam or Peru, you get a smile from all the members of Parliament that they know their treasury is exactly the same. So it's a universal matter for treasuries. But it meant the government had to give way, and it presented the bill, and it was passed by the biggest majority that anyone has done in Parliament in peacetime. Only 8 people voted against it. And they're the same 8, they still don't agree with it, and they never will. But we passed the Act, therefore, as a common agreement by Parliament, which is hugely important, because it means that it really does have a permanent status. And we have no way of binding the next Parliament. Any Parliament can undo what the previous Parliament has done, and therefore this was the challenge, because there are 2 timescales which are important. The first is the democratic timescale, the 4 or 5 years of a government and then refreshing that government. And the second is the climate change timescale, which is that you've got to have a permanent and continuing policy if you're going to solve these problems. You can't shift and change every 4 or 5 years. And so what the Climate Change Act did was to try to put those 2 together. So what happens is we have an independent committee. It's made up entirely, except for myself, of the top climate scientists, 2 of the internationally famous economists. So this is a scientifically based committee, and we have a secretariat of something between 28, 30 people, who again are all specialists, and we sit together, and our first job is to produce the budgets, because the law says that by 2050 we have to reduce our emissions by 80%. That's the emissions of 1990 have got to go down by 80%. And the job of the committee is to provide a route to do that, which is the most cost-effective way of delivering that end, which is a legally enforceable end. In other words, any government has got to be working towards it. And we do that by producing 5-yearly budgets. And the trick is that we produce them far enough ahead, both to give business and civil society knowledge of what they will be expected to do, but also they are voted through by Parliament sufficiently far ahead for members of Parliament to be rather more independent and more far-sighted than they would be if you were voting for what was going to happen next year. Because if you're voting, as we will be voting, for the next, in about 4 years' time, we will be doing the 6th carbon budget, which is 2034 to 2038, beginning of the one and the end of the other 5 years. Well, you don't think you're going to be in that constituency by then, and therefore you can think about what is good for mankind. So the fact is, we've now had 5 carbon budgets, all of which have been passed by Parliament. So Parliament gives the democratic control. But once it's passed the budget, it can't change it. And that's the crucial issue. So that you can't keep changing it whenever it's inconvenient. The budget is there and set. And the only way it can be changed is if the Climate Change Committee, entirely independent, Climate Change Committee were to say that the situation has altered so much that the basis of the budget is now means that it has to be recalibrated, made tougher or less tough. So there is the committee, independently chosen. The chairman There's only been 2 chairmen. I'm the second chairman. I've just been appointed for my second 5-year term. Not allowed to be there for longer than 10 years. My predecessor was there for 7. And I've done first period, and now I've been reappointed. And you are appointed, and this is the crucial thing, you are appointed independently. So I'm appointed by the Climate Change Minister, the First Minister of Scotland, the First Minister of Wales, and the First Minister of the North of Ireland. So they are bound to be, almost certainly, 4 different parties. And that's crucially important. And so, appointed by a Liberal Democrat minister in the coalition government at the time, a Labour minister in Wales, Scottish nationalist in Scotland, and a Protestant unionist in the North of Ireland. And they chose a Conservative Catholic, so that was quite amazing. So you are indeed independent. And that independence is hugely important. And so we set the budgets. And when the budget is set and Parliament has voted for it, then the government has to respond within a period of time, a specific period of time, with a plan as to how it is going to meet those budgets. And again, that's the balance between democracy and climate change. We present, as a climate change committee, a series of scenarios, because we've got to show that our budget is possible. Obviously, when you're doing something cost effectively, you've got to show that it can be done. So we show a series of scenarios. And the government then has to produce, within a time limit, what it has chosen as its means of reaching the budget, which by then, of course, has become law. It has to do it. Now, that's another key issue. The Climate Change Act means that there are dates in it. So the government has got to do it by that date, and it can't put it off. Very important, says as a politician. I was a minister in Conservative governments for 16 years. I know perfectly well what ministers want to do. They want to put it off to the next minister if it's difficult. And so you can't do that because the dates are there. And similarly, every year, by the end of June, the Climate Change Committee has to do an independent assessment of whether the government is meeting its targets or not, measuring what it should be doing, and making sure that it does do it. And of course, because it is the law, it is justiciable. So if the government were manifestly behindhand, clearly not going to meet its budget, then it would be possible for someone to take it to court, and it would then use the Climate Change Committee's reports as proof that the government was not doing what it should do. I wouldn't take them to court, but I suspect I would be witness number 1 for the prosecution if they were taken to court. Now, this puts the government in a very tough position, but it also is extremely helpful to the government. And this is what I want to say to Spanish politicians, because the great advantage of this is you can blame the act. You don't have to say, excuse yourself. You just have to do it. That's what the law says, so you do it. You're obeying the law. You find the best way to do it. And we've now had three budgets. The government has met every one of them. It's going to be in real difficulty for the 4th because it's tougher as you go on. But the facts are extremely exciting. We've reduced our emissions already by 40%, and we have increased our economic activity. We've had a growth of 60%. So the idea that this decreases your growth, we've had one of the fastest growths in Europe. Of course, we're about to destroy that by our ridiculous concept of leaving the European Union, which I am utterly opposed to and wish to say so is every sane person in the United Kingdom, and that you better know. We're going to do everything possible to make sure it doesn't happen. And the fact is, though, that what we've proved is that emissions and the reduction of emissions isn't a danger to your economic growth. And that's been proved particularly recently, because in responding to the Climate Change Committee's budget, the fourth and fifth carbon budgets, which for technical reasons they did together, the government produced a thing called the Clean Growth Strategy. And the unique thing about this was that its clean growth strategy is absolutely at the centre of its industrial strategy. And what the government has said, and this, you remember, is a Conservative government, what the Conservative government has said is there can be no proper growth unless it is green growth. And it points to the fact that the major areas of growth in our economy have been green areas. It's that where we are growing. And it makes the point that Paris underlines and makes certain the fact that nobody is going to buy things unless they are more energy efficient, meeting the issues that we are faced with in climate change. So if you want to grow by exports, if you want to say, let's take the arguments in Spain about the automobile industry. The British automobile industry has recognised that we are going to have, even under the most conservative views, by 2045, no cars which are not electric. We have said we've got to bring that back to 2035 or even 2030. Well, there's no point in building an automobile industry based upon the principle that you're going to go on producing the same old rubbish that you're producing now. And when I hear people from the Spanish automobile industry talking about it's very bad for the industry and we've got all the difficulties with the supply chain and all the rest of it, you just have to say to them, well, it's a matter of whether you want to be like Kodak or not. If you want to be like Kodak and close down because you don't realise what's happening in the world, then do it. But it'll be bloody expensive and it won't do your workers any good. The future is... This is one of the areas where the future is obvious. It's not often obvious, but it is here obvious. So get on to it, do it, and realise the quicker you do it, the cheaper it'll be, and the more you'll benefit by it. And you have to say that about all sorts of things. I mean, we're closing down our coal industry entirely. There will be no generation by coal after the year 2022. We hope it'll bring it back to 2020. It's certainly closing down faster than we had ever expected. That's a huge change. After all, we're with a country that started the coal industry. I mean, we still have... We have to do more than anyone else because we've actually caused more climate change than any other single nation because we've been at it longer. So therefore we have a moral responsibility, which is rather different from almost anybody else. But that is what we have to do. And the way we have sought to do it is to institutionalise the mechanisms so that in fact you know where you're going, people can prepare for it, and they therefore can be in advance of others. I feel very sorry for the Americans. But, well, I feel sorry for them in lots of ways, but I'm particularly sorry for them at the moment because Mr. Trump is putting them on the back foot. When he talks about America's open for business, yeah, it's open for dirty business, and nobody wants that. So, and interestingly, the people who are most opposed to him are the big international companies that know that that's not the direction that things are going. And so governments have got to recognise where we are going, and that's what we've done by this, is to institutionalise the mechanisms. Now, I've got about 3 minutes more, and I just want to say the key other issues. The first thing is the committee has to be independent. You cannot do it unless it's independent, and it doesn't want a lot of people representing this group and that group and civil servants and the rest. It needs people who are scientific economists so that people believe what they say. Our great strength is that even the climate change deniers, even the people who've been hoodwinked by American heritage and other groups, even they have never been able to undermine our facts. And that's absolutely crucial. So you need to have a committee which is independent and science-based. Secondly, it's not like any other committee. So when people say to me, oh, well, it's very difficult in Spain because we've got to fit it into our institutional arrangements. Well, I have to say we have no such thing in Britain. This is the only committee that's like this. We invented it for the purpose because it's a unique purpose. And somehow or other you have to do that, because if you don't do it, it can't do the job. And if you have to say, oh, well, we've got to have this region represented, and if we've got to have this group of people, and we've got to have these politicians, absolutely hopeless. I happen to have been a politician, but I've been a politician who was Minister of Agriculture, who turned our agricultural department into an environmental department, and then I was the Minister for the Environment. So I've got a bit of a history of this whole business. But again, even I had to go through a proper process of being chosen amongst a lot of other people and being chosen by this very peculiar collection of people who have very different views. And the idea that Parliament is going to pick your best climate scientists to sit on a committee seems to me to be pretty balmy. You've got to have a system whereby you really do have the people whom people respect, and they've got to be respected by their own people too. Our committee is respected by economists, because we've got two of the best economists in Britain, probably in the world, and by the scientists, because we've got certainly the best scientists who would vie with anybody in the world. And the third thing that's absolutely crucial about it is that you do have a system where the budgets are real and can't be changed, because if you allow them to be changed, you get back into the principle of putting off to tomorrow that which you should do today. And that's really the danger. And if you do that, it costs so much more money. The last thing is this. What you're doing is perhaps counterintuitively a mechanism for saving people money. And I just give you this fact. We pay for all the transition of our electricity from fossil fuels to wind and solar with a bit of nuclear. We pay for that because there is an addition to the bill which people pay, and 85% of people in Britain have what's called a dual tariff. They have both gas and electricity. Their bills have increased by £9 a month in order to pay for this. But they have decreased by £20 a month because of the energy efficiency which we have produced as a result of it. So they're using a lot less electricity. And once you translate this into bills, and don't talk about the cost per kilowatt hour, and I've no idea what a kilowatt hour is. I can't see it, I can't feel it, I've no idea what it means, and nobody else does either, in my view, unless you are a geek of very unpleasant and boring kind. So, you've got to translate it into the language which people understand. And the fact is that anything you buy today is much more energy efficiency than it was yesterday. We've got a boiler scrappage scheme, which we do, and every time anybody puts in a new boiler, they've changed the emissions enormously. And of course, they've lowered their bill too, hugely. So the result of that is that you can show to people this important fact, is that they are paying for it, but they are immediately getting financial advantages if you get this right. Now, I know you've got complicated electricity bills which defeat anyone to understand them. I realise that, and that may well be a difficulty. But the fact of the matter is, just remember, only 6 years ago, and now I will use the word I said I didn't understand, 6 years ago, offshore wind cost us £200 a kilowatt hour. That is now £52 a kilowatt hour. In 6 years, the price has gone down from 200 to 52. Why? Because we had an order book. Because people knew that they were going to get the chance to do it. And then we have a competition now, so they constantly fight to lower the price. It's now cheaper than almost any other way of producing electricity, and as you know, in Britain, the wind somewhere or other is blowing most of the time. We're not so good about solar. But what the blazes are you doing, still using coal when you've got all this sun? It's an amazing country. You ought to be producing solar for the rest of Europe. I've always thought that we should leave the French to have their nuclear. We should be producing the wind. You should be producing the solar, and we should be spreading it through everyone else. So much we can do. And the Climate Change Committee will continue to try to do it, and anything we can do to help you do what has, I have to say, been a remarkable success, we'd be very happy to do so.
Thank you.
I went over time, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Lord Deepen. That was very inspirational, I must say, and a lot of fun. So now we turn to Pedro. Pedro is going to talk to us about the 2030-2050 scenarios that he has developed for Economics for Energy, which he funded and heads at the moment. Pedro, cuando quieras.
¿Lo en inglés? ¿Para que él me entienda? ¿O?
Me parece fenomenal.
Okay,
si no,
so many of you have already listened to me talking about scenarios, so I'm going to change a bit. I'm going to be talking in English so that Lord Deepen can understand and follow it a bit. I was also told that I was not able to show any pictures. Again, most of you have already looked at them. So I would rather try to concentrate on the major lessons that we can get out of the exercise that we were doing for the last time, and try to connect that with many of the messages that have been sent to us from Britain, from the UK. When I was listening to Lord Deepen, there were a couple of thoughts that came to my mind. The first one is, I wish some members of our government were here listening and taking notes. The second is, many of you know Ignacio Pérez Arriaga, who's probably the professor who knows more about energy in Spain and in the world at least. And Ignacio, although he loves Spain, he always says, I wish I had a British regulator. You can understand after listening to Lord Deepen why. The fact of having independence and of having a science-based approach to all these issues, I think, is fundamental. And in our modesty, this is what we have been trying to do from the university, to try to provide society with this independent, science-based approach. As I was telling Gonzalo before, we don't like to provide too much policy advice. We think that that should be done by society, by policymakers. What we try to provide is facts, and to let society decide based on these facts. And then, of course, we can also provide some win-win policy advice that we are able to extract out of those different scenarios. So I will talk a bit about the lessons that we have been extracting from these scenarios. If those of you who have already listened to this presentation know that since we understand, as Karl Popper said, that it is absolutely impossible to predict the future, what we, instead of producing one scenario, we try to produce several that will help us to prepare for the future. We don't want to predict, we want to be prepared for it. And the four scenarios we were studying were one in which we try to comply with the climate change goals of the European Union, which is basically these 80 to 95% reduction for 2050. And of course, the intermediate one in 2030, which is quite important to try to make both targets consistent. The second scenario is one in which, instead of going for that deep decarbonization, as it might be called, we somehow stay a bit closer to the nationally determined contributions provided to the current climate change agreements, which, as you know, are less ambitious than they should be if we are to get to this 2-degree, 1.5 degree. That we can call business as usual, whatever you may call it. Third scenario is what happens if we go for this decarbonization, but we also rely on the huge improvements that we are seeing in technology developments. And we even assume that these technology developments will become bigger and will come to save our lives somehow. That we call the advanced technology development. And the last one, and this is one, these 3 scenarios, a lot of studies look at them, right? They're quite common. We also wanted to introduce a more pessimistic one, because nobody wants to talk about pessimistic news. Everybody wants to produce very optimistic scenarios. But I think also part of the exercise is to be prepared for a more pessimistic outcome and what would happen in that case, right? And of course, you're all aware of this discussion about the secular stagnation of our economies. I think now we are a bit over the crisis. There is less discussion about it. But if you look at technology development rates, you can get convinced about the solidness of this idea. I'm not saying that they are right. I'm saying that this idea is probable, and we should at least take it into account. So we developed another 4th scenario in which we looked at what would happen if we run out of money, basically. What happens if our economies don't grow as much? What happens then if the priority of societies is to try to secure jobs and get in all these nationalistic dynamics that we have been seeing lately? What would happen then to an energy scenario? What could be the implications, right? And so when we run our models and we see what are the outcomes that we are assumed to get under these assumptions about climate change emissions, carbon emissions, and cost of technologies, there are some interesting implications that I would like to summarize very briefly. One is, first, achieving climate change scenarios, achieving the emissions reductions envisaged by the European Union is feasible, especially for 2030. For 2030, in fact, we might consider it to be too easy. And more about that later. But 2030 scenarios seems to be very much achievable in Spain. 2050 are also technically achievable. I'm not saying that they are easy. I'm saying that they are technically achievable and that we have the resources and the means to achieve them. Of course, the challenge is what do we need to do to get there, right? But that's the first conclusion. The first thing is we can do that. The second thing is we can do that, but if we have to get to a certain point in 2050, we may need to think it from now, as the UK is already doing. We were discussing the other day at Dinner Club. We may have 2-3 years to discuss things until we need to install more equipment. But in 2-3 years, we need to start installing the equipment that will be there for 2050. And if we want to make the right decisions then, we need to start making them right now, right? And ensuring that developments are consistent is really important. And one of the things we see in our scenarios is that if, for example, we go for the business as usual in 2030, because we think that it's achievable, it's the agreements that we already have with the European Commission, that we should only reduce 26% our emissions for our non-point source sectors, that non-ETS sectors. If we assume that these are our targets, then the only problem is that if we follow that trend, we may overshoot in 2050. We may not reach the goals in 2050 because we will already have installed a set of generation equipment, of transport equipment, or final end-use equipment that will make us impossible to achieve the 2050 target. And that internal dynamic consistency between 2030 targets and 2050 targets, I think it's really important, and that's why I also agree that it is so important to do things in advance and with the lights in the long position, looking well ahead, right? Third element that I would like to highlight from these data that we get from these scenarios, the advanced technology scenario is great, right? Technology comes to save us. Photovoltaics reduces a lot the cost. Everything is so cheap. We are so happy to have this scenario happening. Yes, but let's be careful, because the only problem when you get those huge technology improvements is that then you become too complacent and you don't save as much as you might. And because it's so cheap, why not use it, right? And the only problem is that when we look at all the scenarios, the role of energy savings and energy efficiency is so important that sometimes having too cheap energy is bad for saving it. And again, that can backfire, and that can make it more difficult to achieve the scenarios. And in fact, this is what we see. What we see is, for example, that the carbon price in a technology advanced scenario, it's even higher, even if the cost of energy is lower. Why? Because we crash quicker against the climate change, against the climate emissions limit. So that's the third lesson. And the fourth lesson, the one we draw from the secular stagnation scenario, is that this is all fine and good unless we get into an economic crisis. If we fall back again into this economic crisis and technology fails us, what do we do? Because then it's very difficult to convince people that employment is not the first priority. It's very difficult to convince politicians, even if we are trying to do this 10 years in advance, that climate is the priority. And that results basically in that we will not be able to meet any of the climate targets in Spain, in Europe, and all over the world. And that, of course, may have very dangerous consequences that 2030, 2050, we may still not see them, but we will experience that in the future. So with these very broad lessons that we get out of the scenarios, what we have been able to provide some very general policy recommendations. The first general policy recommendation is we need to look well ahead. 2035 is great, 2050 is even better. We need to start running all those scenarios and looking at the implications, but we need to set already the policy that will allow us to get there. And that means that if we want to somehow have an influence on the investments that will need to be made from 2020 to 2030, we need to have already in place, for example, the right carbon price. We need to have in place the right regulations. And of course, and this is essential, we need to have in place the right governance and the right institutional design. And this is not only regarding climate, the Climate Commission. We also, for example, need to think about what is the right design for our power market that will allow us to get to a fully decarbonized electricity sector, which is something that we absolutely will need in 2050 in all of these scenarios. How are we able to get to that? If we don't design it right from now, we will find ourselves in 2040 thinking about, wow, this is not what I wanted. So the importance of long-term signals is essential, and we should be designing policy right now based on long-term scenarios, not on the day-ahead problem that is coming out in the media, as sometimes one has the impression that is the driver for many policy decisions. Two additional elements regarding long-term views. I think part of the job, of course, has to be done by national governments. Part of the job also will be provided by international institutions, and I think here climate finance is essential. And private companies are already listening to this signal that international institutions and international investors will not back fossil fuels investments, and this is also a very clear sign of what is going on. And also R&D. Again, technology has to be managed correctly, but the point is that we have a lot to gain from good technology developments. Now, the only thing is that in a small country like Spain or even the UK, we should not expect ourselves to develop this new technology. We need to work together, and ideas like mission innovation, for example, that is being promoted at the international climate agreements arena is a great example. And we should participate much more instead of just trying to save our own parcel. Second big message, and I'm going to meet your target also, the importance of energy savings, essential for meeting all the targets. In all these scenarios, there is a strong participation of energy savings and energy efficiency. If you forget about this, you're never going to meet the targets. Third element, I already mentioned, decarbonized electricity system. We need that for all scenarios. More ambitious, less ambitious, the electricity sector is going to be decarbonized if we need to meet the targets. We need to start to think about how to make that happen. And the challenge is big. We don't know how it works. We need to start thinking about it and trying to make it happen. And here, for example, it's not only about storage, it's not only about renewables, it's also the role of demand. What is the role of demand? How can we activate demand and make it participate in the market and help us get this flexible system that we need if we want to get renewables into it? And finally, we always talk about the power sector. We always talk about somehow electric vehicles. When people ask me about what is the most relevant challenge that we think we have looking at 2050, for me it's industry. How are we able to keep manufacturing with renewable energy? How do we decarbonize industry? That for me is the real challenge. And again, we need to start thinking about it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Y mis disculpas por haber sido tan severa con el tiempo, pero tenemos una restricción y no quería cerrar este evento antes de la llegada de la Secretaria de Estado sin darles la oportunidad de formular algunas preguntas. Así que si hay preguntas en la sala, les rogaría que levantasen la mano y se presentasen y fuesen muy concisos en la pregunta, como también espero que sean concisos en la respuesta. Now we're going to a round of Q&A, and I'm asking everyone to present themselves and be very short in their questions. ¿Tenemos preguntas en la sala? Y si no, caballero, tercera fila, cuarta fila. Gracias.
Thank you. Soy Javier Jiménez Ugarte, diplomático. Very quickly, I would like to congratulate Lord Deben for his wonderful presentation. I completely agree with the President of Elcano that it is a privilege for us to have you here. And after what you have explained to us, we are really envious. My question would be, I would like to continue enjoying listening to you speaking about Trump and his energy policy and the consequences all around the world. Because what's going to happen, other countries are going to follow suit. That would be my question. Thank you.
I didn't really understand what you said. That's right. What was the question?
You were speaking about Trump,
yes,
and you are quite angry.
Yes.
But I wanted to ask, do you think that the Trump policy is going to be imitated? Is it going to be by other countries? Is it going to have an influence in many other countries?
No. No, I don't. I think that President Trump is a passing phenomenon. I mean, that I must say. But he's a very important warning phenomenon too, because he's there because a lot of people felt left out. A lot of people felt that life was moving too fast and they didn't like it. I talked to somebody who voted for us to leave the European Union, and I said to him, why did you want to leave the European Union? He said, because the vicar is gay. Nothing to do with it at all, but he doesn't like the world he lives in. So this was an opportunity to say, bugger off, we don't want this kind of thing. And I'm afraid Trump is in the same position. So our problem is that we've got to be much better at communicating the realities of life to people. I don't think he is going to... I think Paris and the realities of climate change. I mean, the thing is, every year that it goes past, the climate change becomes more obvious to all of us. It's happening now, it's not happening in the future. It's absolutely happening now. You know that by the amount of salad you can't grow today, which you were able to grow before because of the shortage of water. Everywhere throughout the world, people are beginning to recognize it. So I don't think that's the case. And by the way, if you want to join in the conversation, do it on Twitter, @LordDeben. We have great fun, and what's more, it's an extremely helpful thing for me because I have a lot of trolls and I need people to fight the trolls.
We will certainly do that. I think we had a question from our president. Oh, sorry, Heikki.
Hello, I'm Heikki Wilstedt from the Spanish Wind Power Association. Thank you very much for your inspiring words. I would like to ask you, how have you managed in the United Kingdom to attract so much investment in renewables?
Well, what we did was to create a market. The Chancellor at the time agreed to the bill we thought it would cost, which was £7.6 billion, and he agreed that we would use that to encourage offshore wind in particular, to have a renewable policy, offshore wind, some nuclear and solar. We have to be a bit careful about solar because solar provides us with energy at the time of the year we don't need it. And we don't have much sun at this time of the year, so it's a bit difficult for us. And that's why we've had to change the tariff to encourage it, because it looked as if we were going to get so much solar, we wouldn't know what to do with the energy in the summer. But what it has done is first of all, by subsidy, by being prepared to pay for the energy when it came onto the grid, and now by competition. They compete for the subsidy, and that's pulled the price down. It's been a good market solution, and we'll soon be in a position in which much of this, certainly solar, will be not needing subsidy. And I see that the very first offshore wind in Holland has been produced without a need for subsidy, and we'll be very close to that. So what it was to invest £7.6 billion, put that on the bills of people, that's what the £9 a month is, and use it in that way. So it was a kick-starting the market, which you have to do because of the people who are in the market at the moment have a very good way of keeping you out. All those big energy companies didn't want it. Now you see the big energy companies moving into offshore wind, into solar, into the alternatives, and that's going to be very different.
Presidente.
Let me change to Spanish because my question is para Pedro. Pedro, tú dices que te hubiese gustado que hubiese gente del gobierno escuchando a Lord Deben. Yo estoy de acuerdo, ya les mandaremos.
Estoy viendo alguno, pero me refería a algún departamento en concreto.
Mandaremos la transcripción a ese departamento en concreto. Pero mi pregunta era un poco maliciosa. Pedro, tú formas parte del comité de expertos, ¿no? ¿Qué echas de menos de lo que nos ha contado Lord Deben? ¿Qué te gustaría haber visto ahora que no te oye nadie del ministerio, ¿no?
No sé si debo responder a esa pregunta. Yo creo que esto es algo que lo que voy a decir yo creo que todo el mundo puede entenderlo, así que no tengo problema en compartirlo. Yo creo que el hecho, por un lado, de que la Comisión, por ejemplo, yo veo dos problemas fundamentalmente en la Comisión. Uno es que la Comisión no tiene medios y por tanto, pues, más allá de la capacidad de cada uno, que ahora hablaré un momentito de esto, pues la capacidad de hacer trabajo es razonablemente limitada. Y luego lo que vemos también es que nuestro trabajo está siendo muy en paralelo con la elaboración de la ley, y yo es un poco lo que quería decir antes. Yo creo que ahora mismo, afortunadamente, con las circunstancias que tenemos en España, tenemos, yo creo, el tiempo necesario para reflexionar, ¿no? Tengo la sensación de que los tiempos se nos han comprimido mucho y quizás un ejercicio como este pues hubiera requerido un poquito más de tiempo y un poquito más de reposo y de conversación, ¿no? De entrar mucho más en diálogo con toda la sociedad. Y esto es, por tanto, es una cuestión de procedimiento. Dicho lo cual, pues yo creo que la Comisión está haciendo todo lo que puede. La gente que hay en la Comisión es gente que sabe, y no lo digo por mí, lo digo por los demás. Y la verdad es que yo, al menos, pues estoy muy a gusto trabajando en la Comisión e intentando contribuir, y yo creo que todos somos conscientes de que tenemos una posibilidad de contribuir a esto. Pero sí, quizás un contexto distinto hubiera sido más beneficioso para la Comisión.
¿Alguna otra pregunta fácil?
David?
Hi, David Howell from Sauerbird Life. We're talking here about two countries which are very different in many different ways. One of them is that Spain has a written constitution and the UK doesn't. And my question is about sectors and about regions. So in the UK legislation, perhaps Lord Deben, you would care to comment on how in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, they are pushing forward with the climate change agenda, the emissions reductions agenda. And then a comment about sectors, agriculture, transport, waste. How is that driven forward by the mechanisms in the UK legislation? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Scotland and Wales are running their own climate change policies. There is no government in the north of Ireland at the moment because they've fallen out with each other once again, so it's difficult to know when there will be. And even when there is, it's difficult because last time they had a climate change minister, he didn't believe in climate change, so not much really happened. But they do have to accept the UK stuff, so it is actually reducing the emissions significantly. Both Scotland and Wales are doing very well. Scotland has tougher targets than the UK as a whole because they're in the competitive business. They want to show they do better than we do, and we use them in the Climate Change Committee because we advise them separately. We produce separate work for them, and we use them in the rest of the UK to say, well, if they can do it, why can't you do it? So it's quite a good operation. The Welsh have got a different way of looking at it. They have a thing called the Next Generation Act, which is to look at this in the whole context of improving the environment and the economy for the next generation. It's extremely good. And on waste, they are ahead of the rest of the United Kingdom. So we use them as a competitor thing in waste in the rest of the United Kingdom. So that's what's happening across the regions. And of course, they have a part to play in the choice of the chairman, and they have to agree any new member of the committee. So they are really integrated into the system. As far as the various sectors are concerned, of course, we set the budgets and we have put the emphasis on what needs to be done first. So the decarbonisation of electricity for us, when there was virtually no renewable energy at all when we started, that was the crucial thing, because you can't do any of the other things unless you've decarbonised the energy system. So that was where we started. We had targets for the different sectors, and in general they have met those targets, which is why the emissions have fallen. But now we concentrate on different things because we've now got a clear route to decarbonise electricity. But that means that we're bringing forward some of the things on the transport front, for example, getting the transport sector to realise that it's got to move, particularly vans, where we've been behind in the European Union. We didn't include vans originally in the reduction or the improvement of the performance of motor cars. And of course, vans are now much more regularly used because of the increase in direct mail, and that's going to be a real issue if we don't reduce their use and use much more electricity there. I think we could have an all-electric van fleet very much more quickly than we're now proper. I think before 2030 we could do it because the big companies should be putting electric vans into the operation because they're largely short journeys which can be dealt with in this way. But the things that we are now saying this particular time have been transport and the design of new buildings and the retrofitting of old buildings, the heat, and in your case, of course, the use of air conditioning. Those are the two things which we have been concentrating on immediately. I think the biggest problem that is now coming up for us to deal with is, well, there are two big problems coming up. One is land use, and the whole issue of agriculture is going to be really difficult. There are some very helpful things in the way, but it is difficult. This is a very conservative sector. It's very difficult to see how you deal with so much of it. That is our next real concentration. And the first thing is you've got to have decent figures, because the agriculture has such bad base figures. So we've said we're not prepared to accept any of the figures until we've got new baselines, which the DEFRA, our Department of Environment, has now produced. This is producing this year. So we'll have a baseline. Because otherwise the farmers always claim that they've had a 3% improvement in their emissions in a year. They've got no way of proving it. They find some farmer somewhere who's measured something and they then multiply that out over the whole of farming. It's just not sensible. So that's going to be a big issue. Getting the facts right, absolutely central. So I've refused to make any statement on agriculture because I don't know. Nobody knows, because we've got no proper basis. Well, from next year we will be doing that. It's going to be a very big area of what we have to do, and around the world it's going to be tremendously important. One last thing is, one of the things that we are absolutely insistent upon is that we do have to have carbon capture and storage. It's impossible to get any of these scenarios to work without CCS. We have to have it. And at the moment, I think that it is a scandal that the big energy companies haven't recognised that they ought to be investing in CCS in a very wide range, because it's the only way to maintain their business. If they can't have CCS, there will be no, I mean, it'll be illegal in Britain to use gas after about 2030, except in emergency for generation. Well, if you want to use gas, if we're talking about all the other, you've actually got to have carbon capture and storage. So why is Shell and BP and I understand why ExxonMobil isn't doing it, because it closed its eyes to the future a long time ago. But the decent petrol companies really ought to be out there spending their customers' money in order to be there in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Antonio Hernandez from KPMG. I'm interested in Brexit. I heard what you mentioned, but if Brexit is in the future carried out, what do you think, which, as experts, the main effects, for instance, in terms of interconnectors, in terms of big green energy targets in the UK, and in terms of financing of projects? Thank you very much.
Well, all our legislation is actually UK legislation. It isn't European legislation. So the Climate Change Committee, the climate change thing, the targets, all that are our own legislation and won't change in any way. We benefit from, of course, our arrangements, the trading arrangements. I mean, the EU TS is not very satisfactory, but it's the basis of what we ought to be doing in the future. It all depends on what the deal is. I mean, I still hope that, and there is a 25% chance that it won't happen. I shall do my best in the House of Lords to see it doesn't happen. As people begin to realise what a ludicrous proposal it is and how lack of any sense it has. And above all, I'm much more interested, it's very damaging for Britain, it's very damaging for the economy, I can make all that argument, but the real thing that is damaging is that it removes the opportunity for Britain to make a contribution to improve the world. I think that's what we're here for. I know that's an almost religious comment, but it is true. Well, that's what we're here for. If we're not here to improve the world, then that is unacceptable. And if you remove from yourself one of the opportunities that you have to help people improve the world, then I think that's wrong. It's not just a question of silly, it's wrong, morally wrong. So that's why I feel very strongly about it. I spent my whole life, I went into politics in order to promote European Union, and I'm not going to leave it without going on promoting European Union. So, but it then depends what the deal is. And if everybody's sensible, the deal will be that we will be, to all intents and purposes, in the European Union, but without the vote. And that's the best deal that we could end up with. And that would be good for all of us. It's a silly thing to have got ourselves into. It may be the only way that we actually continue the things. But we've got to have interconnections. We've got to have the same... In any case, we're going to have the same regulations, because we won't be able to export to the rest of Europe if we don't. The whole thing is a nonsense. So just let's hope that Mrs. May in the end, who is remarkably persistent. Whatever else you say, I'm a resilient woman. Let's just hope she delivers. That's right.
Well, thank you very much. Please, por favor, un aplauso. Tenemos aquí a la secretaria de Estado. Así que las preguntas tienen que finalizar aquí y quería agradecer a María García Rodríguez que esté aquí con nosotros hoy. El presidente la presentará.
Muchas gracias. Quería simplemente, como estaba anunciado, dar las gracias a María García por su presencia hoy, la secretaria de Estado. Casi todo el debate ha sido una preparación para tu intervención. Ha sido crear el ambiente y el interés y la incógnita de cuál es la situación de la ley del cambio climático, si se va a crear o no un comité climático como el que hay en el Reino Unido, etcétera. De modo que te escuchamos con enorme interés y, de nuevo, pues muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos y por tu intervención para clausurar esta reunión. Tienes la palabra.
Bueno, pues con semejante introducción, y aunque no he oído las preguntas, espero estar a la altura en las respuestas que yo pueda apuntar. Buenos días, presidente del Instituto Real Elcano, presidente del Comité de Cambio Climático de Reino Unido, demás participantes, buenos días a todos. Yo, en primer lugar, quiero agradecer al Real Instituto Elcano su invitación para poder participar hoy en esta clausura de esta mesa redonda que se ha celebrado bajo el tema Leyes climáticas y escenarios de transición energética, el Reino Unido y España. Por hacer una introducción que me imagino que sonará conocida, pero que yo no me canso de repetir, el cambio climático es sin duda el mayor reto al que se enfrenta la humanidad, al que nos enfrentamos todos por sus impactos económicos, por sus impactos sociales y por sus impactos, por supuesto, propiamente medioambientales. Por poner unos datos de contexto, los más recientes que tenemos, aunque hay miles, la Organización Meteorológica Mundial acaba de confirmar que 2016 y 2017 han sido los 2 años más cálidos de la historia. Y han puesto de manifiesto, además, ha puesto de manifiesto la Organización Mundial que la concentración de dióxido de carbono en la atmósfera aumentó a una velocidad récord en 2016, alcanzando los niveles más altos en 800.000 años. Todo ello, sin duda, como consecuencia de la emisión de gases de efecto invernadero, que entre los años 1900 y 2010 se ha multiplicado por 13 hasta los 35 millones de kilotoneladas de CO2 equivalente en el que estamos ahora. De manera que baste con estos datos para ilustrar en lo que creo que hay un consenso generalizado, no solamente un aval científico, sino un consenso político y social generalizado de que este es un reto de primer orden. Un reto, además, que nos interpela a todos, que es eminentemente global y que, por tanto, para ser abordado requiere, sin duda, una respuesta global. Eso es, de hecho, lo que yo creo que conseguimos después de mucho tiempo con el Acuerdo de París que se lanzó en el año 2015, que es el primer acuerdo en la historia jurídicamente vinculante sobre cambio climático, que cubre el 99% de las emisiones de CO2, que es una ambición global, viniendo de lo que veníamos en el periodo de Kioto, viniendo de lo que veníamos en Kioto 1 y en Kioto 2, hemos pasado de estar solo unos pocos y no todos los que teníamos que estar, a estar todos. Y todos tenemos que aportar en esta lucha contra el cambio climático. A fecha de hoy han ratificado ya el Tratado 174 de los 196 países que son parte de la Convención de Cambio Climático y todos ellos cuentan ya con sus planes nacionales de luchas contra el cambio climático, que son las contribuciones de cada uno. En esos planes lo que se recoge es qué tiene que hacer cada país, cada Estado miembro, para contribuir al cumplimiento del Acuerdo de París. Lo cual ya es de por sí, no es todo, pero es de por sí un éxito sin precedentes en esta lucha contra el cambio climático, que ahora tiene que ser seguido por el siguiente paso, todavía más importante, que es el de llevar este éxito de compromisos, este éxito de compromiso global, al terreno de los hechos, que no es poco. Todos los países tenemos que afrontar un escenario de transición, no solo España, todos, desde un modelo económico evidentemente muy dependiente de los combustibles fósiles a otro bajo en carbono y basado en fuentes de energía más limpias y más eficientes. Y esta transición, como todas, para ser exitosa, tiene que realizarse de forma ordenada, planificada, coste eficiente y sostenible, es decir, en línea con los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Y si no somos capaces de hacerlo así, no seremos capaces de hacer una transición efectiva. Se trata, como en todos los ámbitos, de buscar un equilibrio que es complejo, pero que debe permitirnos, por un lado, garantizar lo que es irrenunciable, que son los compromisos, los objetivos ambientales ya asumidos, y esos ya están ahí, con independencia de que la ley en la que estamos trabajando deba facilitar su cumplimiento, pero esos ya están ahí y ya nos obligan y ya tenemos que cumplirlos. Y, al mismo tiempo, además de garantizar el cumplimiento de esos objetivos irrenunciables, tenemos que tener en cuenta en el tema de la transición energética otros factores muy importantes, porque es tanto como hablar de la vida de las familias y de la competitividad de nuestras empresas. Por tanto, como en todo, tendremos que ser capaces de hacer una transición lo suficientemente ordenada y equilibrada como para, sin ninguna duda, cumplir con lo que es irrenunciable y ya tenemos comprometido, pero hacerlo además con una transición que nos permita tener siempre en cuenta los perjuicios a familias y empresas. Para los países de la Unión Europea, además, y por supuesto para España como miembro de la Unión Europea, este reto es especialmente exigente, porque quien tiene y quien ha tenido desde el principio sobre la mesa los compromisos más ambiciosos en el ámbito de la lucha contra el cambio climático es y ha sido la Unión Europea. Como mínimo, en 2030 tenemos que haber reducido nuestras emisiones un 40% frente a 1990 y más del 80% para el año 2050. España, en particular, deberá reducir en el año 2030 un 26% sus emisiones en los sectores difusos, transporte, residencial, agricultura, residuos, respecto de los niveles del año 2005. Un objetivo, más allá de las cifras y de los porcentajes, que supone casi triplicar los esfuerzos de reducción actuales, es decir, hacer mucho más de lo que estamos haciendo ya para poder lograr cumplir con lo que nos hemos comprometido. También, por supuesto, deberemos participar en los objetivos de impulso de las energías renovables y de los objetivos de eficiencia energética que están ahora mismo en discusión en trílogos y que se cerrarán en Bruselas en los próximos meses. Tenemos, en todo caso, un buen punto de partida, tanto en el ámbito internacional como en el ámbito europeo, como en el ámbito nacional, por todo lo que vengo explicando. España está comprometida con el objetivo de París, lo hemos ratificado y tenemos además a nivel nacional, en el ámbito europeo, tenemos todos los paquetes desarrollados, solo por cerrar el tema de los objetivos de energías renovables y eficiencia energética. Y en el ámbito nacional existe un amplísimo consenso social y político que apoya la puesta en marcha de medidas para cumplir con este objetivo. Partiendo de eso, tenemos además un buen trecho de camino recorrido. En 2012, y 2012 no fue hace tanto, la Comisión Europea nos advertía que no solo no se había avanzado en el camino de reducción de emisiones, sino que habíamos incrementado un 15% nuestras emisiones respecto a 1990. Y en 2012 lo que teníamos sobre la mesa era una advertencia de la entonces comisaria de que estábamos en riesgo cierto de incumplir Kioto 1. En 2016, la Convención Marco de Naciones Unidas ha certificado que España ha logrado su compromiso, de manera que en solo 4 años, que es un periodo largo para algunas cosas y muy corto para otras, esta tendencia se ha revertido. Cumplimos con Kioto 1, estamos en senda para cumplir con Kioto 2 y estamos trabajando desde el principio para cumplir con el siguiente periodo mucho más amplio y global, que es el que marca el Acuerdo de París. Entre 2011 y 2016, las emisiones totales de gases de efecto invernadero en España se han reducido un 9,5%. Y esto lo hemos conseguido en un escenario de crecimiento económico, que yo creo que es lo más importante, porque por primera vez hemos conseguido desacoplar ambos parámetros, lo cual quiere decir que eso de que se puede reducir emisiones y luchar contra el cambio climático y al mismo tiempo crecer económicamente es cierto y está avalado por los datos. Y en ese camino estamos ya a día de hoy en España. Hemos cumplido, por tanto, el primer periodo de Kioto, como decía, pero además estamos en la senda de cumplir el segundo periodo de compromiso y en este sentido yo quiero recordar, porque siempre tendemos en España a ponernos los últimos de la fila y no siempre somos los últimos de la fila, que vamos un 10% por delante en esta senda del segundo periodo de Kioto de otros países como son Francia o Alemania. Esto por decir en qué punto estamos en el camino con lo que a día de hoy tenemos que cumplir, que es Kioto 1 ya cumplido, Kioto 2 y después Acuerdo de París. Y esto ha sido posible, al menos en parte, porque hemos puesto en marcha políticas e iniciativas que tienen como objetivo fundamental reducir emisiones y hacerlo generando actividad económica sostenible y empleo de calidad. Hemos trabajado mucho con el sector privado, con medidas que no voy a citar ahora ni a desglosar, pero en el marco de los planes de impulso al medio ambiente, con proyectos clima, poniendo en marcha un registro de huella de carbono en el que este año creo que ya van más de 1000 huellas registradas, y hemos dado también, en la parte más propia de energía, un impulso en las energías renovables. En los 2 últimos años, partiendo de la situación que partíamos, que tampoco voy a recordar, pero yo creo que todos conocemos, se han adjudicado casi 8000 megavatios de potencia renovable, 50% de eólica y 50% de fotovoltaica, sin coste para el consumidor, lo cual es muy importante, y que van a incrementar otro 10% la potencia instalada. Y ahora, sobre la base del trabajo que hemos realizado en los últimos años, sobre la base de los avances que ya tenemos, sobre la base de que somos un país que cumple Kioto, de que somos un país que está en la senda de cumplir Kioto II y de que somos un país que ha suscrito el Acuerdo de París y que estamos trabajando para ponerlo en marcha, creo que estamos en el mejor momento para elaborar una ley de cambio climático y transición energética que debe ser, insisto, un marco para facilitar el cumplimiento de nuestros objetivos a 2030 y 2050. Y digo un marco para facilitar porque, insisto, los objetivos ya están y con o sin ley debemos cumplirlos. Y yo creo que es el momento más oportuno porque nunca antes hemos tenido un marco global como el que tenemos y el que nos da a todos el Acuerdo de París, un marco europeo con todos los paquetes desarrollados como el que tenemos actualmente, donde el trabajo que ha hecho la Unión Europea bajo el liderazgo de Miguel Arias ha sido tremendamente enriquecedor en estos años, y un marco nacional de consenso sin precedentes, al menos en el punto de partida, en que debemos hacer una ley que nos ayude a cumplir los objetivos. Estamos de acuerdo todos que no es poco. Y además estamos en una legislatura políticamente que debe ser la legislatura del diálogo. Y no porque lo diga yo o porque suene bien, sino porque así ha sido la decisión de los ciudadanos. Entonces, si es necesario acordar para hacer política, ahora es más necesario y conveniente que nunca. La Ley de Cambio Climático nace, el trabajo que nosotros empezamos nace del compromiso que se asumió por el propio presidente del Gobierno, lo hizo ya en la Conferencia de París en diciembre de 2015, y con esto España se suma a iniciativas similares de otros países de nuestro entorno que han hecho lo mismo y han desarrollado herramientas normativas para facilitar su cumplimiento. Nosotros lo que queremos, a mí me han preguntado muchas veces que si tengo un texto de la ley. Yo no tengo texto de la ley, porque si lo tuviera, básicamente no podría decir que queremos que esto sea una ley de todos y queremos que sea una ley de todos. La ley tiene que ser un marco que nos permita hacer eso que decíamos al principio, hacer una transición ordenada, pero efectiva, hacia un modelo bajo en carbono y competitivo que se adapte a los impactos del cambio climático y que al mismo tiempo suponga, porque puede serlo y debe serlo, una oportunidad para el crecimiento económico. Como trabajo interno empezamos a trabajar desde el inicio de la legislatura, constituimos un grupo interministerial que tenemos en marcha, que integra los esfuerzos de todos los departamentos y asegura la coherencia de las actuaciones. Esta frase tan larga no agota lo complicadísimo que es trabajar en el marco de un grupo interministerial tan grande como este, porque aquí están todos los departamentos afectados implicados a la hora de elaborar una ley de cambio climático y transición energética, y esto nos exige internamente hacer un enorme esfuerzo para integrar perspectivas y hacer medidas sensatas en todos los ámbitos, porque es que estamos hablando de todos los ámbitos. Estamos hablando de la energía, estamos hablando del tema del transporte, estamos hablando de todos los temas también vinculados con la salud. Yo creo que no hay un solo ministerio que no esté integrado y que no deba estar integrado en este esfuerzo. Esta dinámica de participación y coherencia interna la abrimos también abriendo un proceso participativo para tratar de incorporar desde el principio las mayores aportaciones posibles de los sectores involucrados, para conseguir de alguna manera que esta ley nazca realmente de todos y que sea una ley participativa al mayor nivel posible. En el mes de mayo organizamos unas jornadas de alto nivel, participaron más de 400 expertos y las conclusiones de esta jornada sirvieron de base para lanzar además un proceso de consulta pública en el mes de julio que estuvo abierto casi 3 meses hasta mediados de octubre para poder recabar el mayor número de aportaciones posibles. En el transcurso de esta consulta se recibieron más de 350 aportaciones, que no es una mala cifra respecto a la que han cosechado otros procesos puestos en marcha en otros países, y se identificaron, y para eso nos ha servido a nosotros, para identificar partiendo de ahí ley, partiendo de las aportaciones de todos los sectores y de todos los expertos y de todos los que se han querido implicar tanto en las jornadas como en la consulta pública, eso nos ha ayudado a identificar las grandes cuestiones que se deben abordar y las decisiones que hay que adoptar en cada uno de los grandes bloques. O sea, a día de hoy tenemos los grandes bloques, las grandes respuestas que tiene que aportar la ley y las grandes decisiones que hay que tomar con esta ley para que realmente sea un marco facilitador. Esos grandes bloques yo los he compartido, hemos tenido ocasión de compartirlos con los grupos políticos para que todos sepamos dónde está y dónde estamos es donde nos sitúan a día de hoy las aportaciones que se han hecho para poder configurar esta ley. Porque, insisto, aunque sea más complicado, pero el objetivo de esta ley es que nazca con una base participativa lo más amplia posible y que la implicación de todos los sectores y de todos los agentes de interés sea la mayor posible y desde el principio. Sobre todo porque esta ley debe tener todas en un marco jurídico como el nuestro, pero desde luego esta tiene una clara vocación de permanencia. Si no somos capaces de establecer un marco de cumplimiento para la lucha contra el cambio climático que supere las coyunturas políticas, pues no seremos capaces de poner en marcha una ley que haga lo que queremos que esta ley haga, que es facilitar el cumplimiento de objetivos que ya tenemos comprometidos. Para que la ley realmente sea un paso más sobre lo ya cerrado en el Acuerdo de París, tiene que ser una ley que permanezca. Si no, difícilmente podrá ayudarnos. Los objetivos son permanentes, por tanto, la ley debe ser lo que debe ser una ley, un marco estable que dé certidumbre a las administraciones, a los inversores y a los ciudadanos para poder caminar en la transición hacia un modelo bajo en carbono. Y esto, insisto, si no lo conseguimos con la implicación de todos y si no lo conseguimos, como se ha hecho en otros países europeos, basándonos en el diálogo político, pues podríamos llevar a cabo una acción de gobierno, pero desde luego no sería una acción útil para la lucha contra el cambio climático. Yo quiero hacer un resumen de dónde nos situamos a día de hoy, después de este trabajo inicial, después de haber cosechado las participaciones para esta ley, respecto a qué cuatro grandes bloques tiene que girar la ley. Por un lado, la ley tiene que fijar unos objetivos claros a 2030 y a 2050, porque la ley debe dar una señal necesaria, que es la que tiene, y en eso sí que la ley puede suponer un paso más allá del Acuerdo de París, que tiene que ser capaz de movilizar las actuaciones de todos, las actuaciones de administraciones, las actuaciones del sector privado y de la sociedad en general, reduciendo a la vez los riesgos del impacto de los cambios del cambio climático en ecosistemas y en sectores. Quiero decir, la ley tiene que dar una señal clara para la movilización de todos en términos de mitigación y en términos de adaptación al cambio climático. Como segundo gran bloque estaría la articulación en torno a los grandes principios rectores que deben guiar una economía baja en carbono, como son la protección del medio ambiente, el principio de quien contamina paga y la coordinación institucional, entre otros. Hay más, pero estos son los tres más grandes que la ley tiene que llevar a la práctica. La ley tiene además que conseguir concretar los instrumentos necesarios, como por ejemplo la participación de los sectores en los objetivos, una financiación coherente que permita impulsar el nuevo modelo bajo en carbono, la integración de la variable del cambio climático en la normativa de todas las administraciones o herramientas para ámbitos clave en este tema de la lucha contra el cambio climático, como son el agua, la salud y la educación. Es decir, la ley tiene que dar una serie de herramientas para poder dejar atado el camino que cada sector tendrá que hacer en su planificación y en sus actuaciones para contribuir al cumplimiento del Objetivo de París y, desde luego, en ámbitos tan importantes como la integración de la variable del cambio climático en toda la normativa, el agua, la salud, la educación, los impactos que tiene y cómo abordar un sistema de financiación coherente que permita impulsar toda esta lucha son capítulos que no podrán quedar fuera de la ley. Y, por último, por supuesto, la ley tiene también, como hablábamos del principio de tener una transición equilibrada y coherente, tendrá que habilitar fórmulas orientadas a los sectores, a las regiones y a los colectivos más vulnerables a la hora de afrontar una transición como estas. También hemos estudiado las soluciones normativas que nuestros socios europeos han diseñado. Esto es lo bueno de partir de alguna experiencia previa. También de ellas hemos extraído valiosas conclusiones que también estamos teniendo en cuenta en el trabajo ya redaccional que estamos haciendo ahora. Por mencionar una especialmente interesante y porque ha sido eje de esta jornada, está desde luego el caso de la iniciativa del Reino Unido y en concreto para nosotros del sistema de gobernanza que ha puesto en marcha. El Comité de Cambio Climático que establece la norma británica es un ejercicio para garantizar desde la independencia el asesoramiento y la correcta aplicación de las políticas climáticas. Una iniciativa que merece desde luego un análisis en profundidad que nosotros estamos llevando a cabo para integrar las conclusiones en la ley, en la propuesta de borrador de ley. Se trata de un ejemplo de los instrumentos que estamos considerando. Hay muchos elementos en esta norma sobre los que reflexionar para nosotros, los hay también en otras normas y todos ellos los estamos valorando para tratar de plantear en esa ley las soluciones más eficaces y más adaptadas a las circunstancias de nuestro país. Por eso para nosotros es de especial interés que se celebren foros como estos, que enriquecen sin duda el debate con resultados de la experiencia de otros países y que nosotros, desde luego, vamos a tener y estamos teniendo ya en consideración en el documento en el que estamos trabajando. Documento en el que estamos trabajando con la aportación, todas las aportaciones que hemos recibido, siguiendo los 4 grandes bloques que yo decía, teniendo en cuenta también la experiencia cosechada de otros países que han aprobado y lanzado una normativa. No son todas distintas, no son todas iguales, pero todas tienen un marco bastante común y con esto nosotros tendremos en el primer trimestre de este año un primer borrador de anteproyecto. Por tanto, y yo creo que lo adelantaba ayer la ministra, que tuvo la ocasión de comparecer precisamente en la Comisión de Cambio Climático en el Congreso, esperamos en pocos meses poder elevar ya a las cámaras un texto que sea participativo, que yo creo que eso lo hemos intentado desde el principio, sólido, solvente y adaptado a nuestras características, que toque todo lo que tiene que tocar, que sea equilibrado y que cumpla con lo que tiene que cumplir una ley, que es ser un marco facilitador que dé una seguridad jurídica suficiente. Un texto, en todo caso, que no será de nadie, sino de todos y que será, insisto, el resultado de todas las aportaciones que hemos ido y que seguimos recibiendo con el fin de que España se dote de una norma que facilite el cumplimiento de los retos del cambio climático, como han hecho otros países, como Reino Unido. Yo termino ya. En este punto estamos ahora trabajando, por tanto, espero que la próxima vez que yo tenga oportunidad de venir a un foro de estas características podamos dar un paso más y explicar un paso más de un texto que espero, en todo caso, que cuente con el consenso que tiene que contar una ley como estas para ser un marco efectivo en la transición energética y en la lucha contra el cambio climático. Yo termino ya, le agradezco de nuevo al Real Instituto Elcano su invitación, felicito a todos por la iniciativa de analizar un ejemplo normativo pionero y me encargaré de que me pasen las conclusiones de la jornada de hoy, por supuesto, para tenerlas lo más en cuenta posible en el trabajo que estamos haciendo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias a la Secretaria de Estado. Creo que han satisfecho plenamente las expectativas que teníamos. No te vamos a someter a preguntas y respuestas. Sospecho que la coyuntura es más bien para que se os deje trabajar tranquilamente y no someteros a respuestas. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Vamos a seguir trabajando sobre el tema. Nos podéis seguir en la página web del Instituto Elcano y, de nuevo, gracias por vuestra compañía. Hasta la siguiente.